and welcome to the podcast of the Gem State Chronicle. My name is Brian Allman. Remember to visit gemstatechronicle.com for all my work, as well as breaking news, press releases, and guest editorials. Subscribe for free or support my work at gemstate.substack.com. And also check out this month's sponsor, Mac Attack HVAC, up in Emmett. If you're plugged into social media, you might have seen the fierce debate over the past few days regarding an interview between Tucker Carlson and a popular historian named Daryl Cooper, who has a podcast called Martyr Made. Cooper's perspective with regards to telling history is to dig into events and movements that are normally repackaged as simple morality tales. His series on Jim Jones and his cult lasted 32 hours because Cooper pulled on every thread in the historical tapestry to see where it leads and to give as much context as possible. Sometimes that's not controversial. When Daryl Cooper presents the story of Jim Jones, or the American labor movement, or even the background on Jeffrey Epstein, most people who hear it nod and say, well, that's interesting. It's when he touches on the founding myths of our society that he gets into trouble. The biggest pushback to Cooper's interview with Tucker Carlson was over his treatment of Winston Churchill. Now, leftists accuse Churchill of being a racist, white supremacist who deliberately starved the people of India to maintain British hegemony. But conservatives generally revere the man. We see him as the savior of Western civilization, who bravely stood up against both Nazism and communism, who, rather than appeasing the evil Nazis like his predecessor Neville Chamberlain, fought them instead. Cooper, however, takes a contrarian view. He suggests that Churchill is the chief villain of World War II, which, considering the other players involved, is quite a take. He did say that he's being deliberately hyperbolic and that he considers Hitler and the Nazis to be evil. However, he believes that Churchill turned what could have been a small conflict, quickly resolved and forgotten, into a massive conflagration that left tens of millions dead and changed the history of the world for the worse. Reactions to this opinion have been over the top. Many conservatives responded as if Cooper killed their dogs, shrieking hysterically that he must be a Nazi. Others seemed to think that explicitly comparing World War II to movies and comic books would somehow make their points for them. Ben Domenech, the son-in-law of John McCain, tweeted a scene from a concentration camp from the miniseries Band of Brothers, while Russell Moore, the leftist editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, posted a screenshot of a Captain America comic book. Seth Dillon of the Babylon Bee mocked the discussion by comparing it to Star Wars. My purpose with today's podcast is not to relitigate World War II. If you want to hear Cooper's take, listen to his interview with Tucker. I would suggest, however, that if you find yourself having an emotional reaction to someone's opinion about historical events that occurred before most of us were born, then take a deep breath and relax. Daryl Cooper didn't kill your dog, he didn't rob your home, he didn't literally piss on anyone's grave. All he did was bring up a perspective on history that you might not have heard before. The mature response is to say, well, that's interesting. Rather than posting on Twitter about how Daryl is clearly a Nazi and that Churchill is more sacrosanct than Jesus, it should instead inspire you to read more history, just to see if what he's saying is true. Maybe you come away more firmly believing what you thought yesterday. If so, great. Your beliefs now rest on a stronger foundation. On the other hand, maybe you realize that some of the things you were taught in grade school, or even in college, were not the whole truth. Again, I'm not here to opine on Churchill specifically. I very much respect the man as a leader and as an historian. His 4-volume history of the English-speaking peoples is one of my all-time favorite works of history. Father Calvin Robinson today on the Lotus Eaters podcast said that he's a hero despite his human flaws. Yet if we're truly interested in truth, then we must confront the shady side of any historical figure that we've been taught to revere, whether it's Churchill, Ronald Reagan, Abraham Lincoln, anyone. The only perfect man was Jesus Christ. The reason I bring this up is because of the way it elucidates modern myth-making. Every group, every nation, every culture has a founding myth that gives that group meaning and direction. By myth, I don't mean Greek gods and heroes, rather a real or fictional story that explains the origins of a nation or group that's used to define what that group stands for today. A good example is the all-American game of baseball. The founding myth of baseball is that future Civil War General Abner Doubleday laid down the rules of the game at a field in Cooperstown, New York. Despite the fact that this story is almost certainly false, it nevertheless forms the framework for how we see baseball in the context of American history. The Hall of Fame sits at the very spot in Cooperstown where Doubleday was supposed to have created the game. Learning a group's founding myth can give you a good idea of what that group stands for and how they measure themselves. You cannot understand Christianity, or Judaism for that matter, unless you know the story of creation. When I refer to the creation story of Genesis as a founding myth, I follow in the footsteps of C.S. Lewis in that I'm not calling it fiction, rather it's a myth that we believe is true. As a myth, it's a story that defines our worldview. The biblical story of creation still provides context for how Christians see humanity's place in the world. Being created in the image of God means that all human beings have an inherent dignity and right to life. Even non-believers owe much of their cultural context to this story, whether it's figures of speech such as forbidden fruit or fig leaves, or the fact that we work 6 days and rest on the 7th. One of the most important parts of any superhero story is the origin story. Superman, the last son of Krypton, has a unique perspective on humanity. Batman saw his parents murdered by a random street thug, and that motivates him to fight crime. Spider-Man's mistake that led to his uncle's murder makes him uncompromising in the face of lawlessness. Writers are continually going back to those origin stories, the founding myths of those superheroes, to mine them for thematic content. In the same way, every generation of Americans continually returns to its own founding myths in order to find meaning in their own lives and times. It makes sense that Russell Moore would cite a comic book as a rebuttal to Daryl Cooper's perspective on Winston Churchill, because these myths, these historical events, are often distilled to a simple black and white good versus evil morality play that explains who you are and who your enemies are. World War II is the founding myth of the modern world. The evil Nazis invaded innocent nations, intending to conquer the world and exterminate so-called undesirable races. One of those innocent countries was the Soviet Union, and since the enemy of the villain cannot itself be a villain, they are cast as the hero in this story. The noble allies, Britain, France, the US, and yes, the Soviet Union, defeated the evil Nazis and saved the world. The villains of a founding myth are nearly as important as the heroes. The story of the Garden of Eden makes little sense without the deceitful serpent. In the same way, the heroism of Allied leaders like Churchill is contrasted with the villainy of Adolf Hitler. Both men transcend humanity, becoming avatars of good and evil. Every tin pot dictator since 1945 is the next Hitler, and every potential war is seen as an echo of World War II. We urge our leaders to confront the next Hitler like Churchill did, rather than appease him like Neville Chamberlain did. This myth has been used to justify military intervention for generations, from Vietnam to Iraq and now to Ukraine. Questioning any component of this myth provokes nearly violent reactions in many people, akin to questioning their parentage or their religion. Anyone who questions Churchill must be a Nazi apologist, as if they're questioning the role of God in the Garden of Eden. You see, myths can be true or false, but they usually contain elements of both. Even if we discover that some element of our own founding myth might not be entirely true, that doesn't necessarily rob it of its power. One of my favorite movies is the John Ford Western, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Spoiler alert for a 62-year-old movie if you haven't seen it yet. Go ahead and pause the podcast, go watch the movie, and then come back and join me here. The framing story of this movie is in a story told by Senator Ransom Stoddard to a young newspaper reporter about the early days of Shinbone, a small town in an unnamed western state. Stoddard arrived in town by stagecoach as a young law school graduate, but was immediately accosted by a local outlaw named Liberty Valance. It turns out that in addition to robbing random people, Valance was also on the payroll of the big cattle barons who opposed statehood and the regulations that it would bring. Stoddard makes the acquaintance of a rancher and gunfighter named Tom Donovan, and his initial impression is that he's no different from Valance. Both men used violence to solve problems, while Stoddard wants to see law, order, and civilization come to the West. To make a long story short, the story culminates with a shootout between Stoddard and Valance. Despite not being comfortable with a gun, Stoddard is compelled to avenge the beating of Shinbone's newspaperman and the ransacking of his office, things that occurred because of what Stoddard wrote supporting statehood and denouncing Liberty Valance. Stoddard is no match for Valance, who shoots the gun out of his hand, then wounds him in the arm, playing with him like a cat with a mouse. Stoddard picks up the gun with one last desperate attempt to shoot, and Valance falls dead. Ransom Stoddard is celebrated as the hero who ended Liberty Valance's reign of terror. This notoriety propels him to the governorship of the new state, and later multiple terms in the Senate. He also wins the girl, Hallie, who was once involved with Tom Donovan. everyone lives happily ever after, right? Well, it turns out there was one man who didn't live happily ever after, and that was the one man who most deserved to. You see, Ransom Stoddard didn't shoot Liberty Valance. It was Tom Donovan who did, popping him with a rifle right before he would have killed Stoddard. Donovan later tells Stoddard the truth, whose initial reaction is to give up rather than living a lie. But Donovan tells him to keep the secret because he knows that it will lead to the greater good. And it does. But not for Tom Donovan. For him, it's the end of everything. He lost his girl, he burns down his cabin in a drunken fit, and he lives the rest of his life as a forgotten nobody. It was men like him who built the American West, but for civilization and law and order to reign, men like Ransom Stoddard needed to be the new heroes. After Stoddard finishes his story, finally telling the whole truth for the first time in his life, the older reporter who's been listening, he takes the notes from the interview and burns them. "This is the West," he says. "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." It's a great movie, with James Stewart, John Wayne, Lee Marvin, and Vera Miles all giving fantastic performances. But if anyone understood the power of modern myth-making, it was John Ford. He started making westerns in the 1910s, when many of the great figures of the Old West were still alive to tell their stories personally. He met Wyatt Earp. John Ford would later travel with the U.S. military to take first-hand footage of World War II. He was wounded while filming the Battle of Midway in 1942, and he filmed the landing at Omaha Beach on D-Day in 1944. He understood something profound. We need myths to give ourselves meaning. Consider how we view the founding of our own country. English settlers came to the New World in order to build a new society freed from the baggage of old Europe. Both the Pilgrim Fathers of Plymouth and the aristocratic planters of Virginia came to America searching for a fresh start. Puritan minister John Winthrop invoked scriptural imagery when he called his colony a shining city on the hill that would both be an example to the rest of the world, but also be held to the strictest of scrutiny. These English colonies grew apart from the mother country, and by the 1770s were chafing under taxation and regulation by a distant king and parliament. Both New England and Virginia played outsized roles in the fight for independence, as Northerners like Sam Adams, Ben Franklin, and John Adams stood alongside Southerners like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. They defeated Great Britain, the superpower of its era, then crafted a constitution that has allowed our country to thrive for nearly a quarter of a millennium. The real story definitely lost some nuance in its transformation from history into mythology, from fact into legend. For example, Great Britain had spent a lot of blood and treasure in North America fighting the French in the 7 Years' War, and some of the taxes that the colonists found intolerable were enacted to pay for that war. The colonists also chafed under Britain's act forbidding them from settling further west than the Appalachian Mountains, which was put into place so as to leave the American Indians in peace. Not only that, but independence was only supported by about a third of the population of the colonies at that time. Another third were royalists, still supporting the British crown no matter what, and the last third was honestly lukewarm. They just wanted to avoid being caught in the middle. In the general evangelical Christian telling of this myth, all the founding fathers were staunch Christians of the same flavor as modern evangelicals. However, while the beliefs of some of our founders track closely with conservative Christians today, others would be considered liberal or even heretical. Yet it is this myth that defines America for most of the descendants of those who fought the Revolution. We look back at our ancestors who built America in the first place, and we measure ourselves by their example. We see the same thing in ancient Rome. Romulus and Remus were descendants of doomed Troy, according to legend, and they built a city on the banks of the Tiber River. The city grew and flourished under 7 kings, but the tyranny of the last king Tarquin was so that brave Romans led by Lucius Junius Brutus overthrew him and swore a solemn oath to never again allow a king to rule Rome. As with our own origin story, this too has its embellishments and outright fictions, yet this story helped guide later generations of Romans, giving them a virtuous example to live up to. When he betrayed his friend Julius Caesar, Marcus Brutus was motivated by the story of his ancestor Brutus, who also overthrew a tyrant. The Roman dictator Cincinnatus was held up as the greatest example of Roman virtue, a man who was handed absolute power only to return it to the people when the crisis was complete. Perhaps this influenced Emperor Diocletian, who reorganized the empire and ruled for 20 years only to retire to his farm to grow cabbages. The legend still remains many centuries later, as George Washington's contemporaries referred to him as the American Cincinnatus because he too gave up absolute power. As you can see, a founding myth does a lot to define a people, and it creates a reference point for virtue and morality. It gives context to a people. It's difficult to understand a culture without some idea of its founding mythology. Earlier I said that World War II was the foundational myth upon which modern society was built. Rather than arguing over the details of that conflict, let's instead look at its fruits. Is the modern world characterized by more freedom, more liberty, true justice, peace, and prosperity? Clearly it's not. All those things are deteriorating quickly, and we have to ask why. Or, to quote another movie, if the rule you follow brought you here, then what was the point of the rule? We should ask questions of our founding myths not because we're angry iconoclasts, but because we recognize that in many ways we've become shackled by our veneration of the past. How many moderate Republicans have tried to cajole conservatives by invoking the holy name of Ronald Reagan? There's an entire organization out there of former Republicans whose only unifying value is their hatred of Donald Trump, and apparently their predilection for molesting teenage boys, and what do they call themselves? The Lincoln Project. In both cases, people are using the mythology around our heroes to try and short-circuit critical thinking about their real goals. If you listened to Daryl Cooper's entire interview with Tucker Carlson, then you'll know that's exactly what he was saying. Regardless of what actually happened in the 1930s and 40s, the myth of World War II has been used to justify many things that are contrary to our ideals of freedom and liberty. Everything from endless foreign wars to censorship on social media are predicated on the idea that we are one rogue world leader or one politically incorrect book away from seeing the ghost of Adolf Hitler rise again to terrorize the world. Confronting the challenges of the modern world means confronting the truth about the past. However, it doesn't mean we need to be iconoclasts, tearing down heroes for no other reason than because we hate heroism. Nor does it mean we need to engage in absurd counter-signaling, like saying that Hitler did nothing wrong. Instead, it means simply accepting the truth for what it is. We can agree that the Nazis were the bad guys, that the Allies were generally good, that the Soviets were untrustworthy partners, and that FDR and Churchill were complicated leaders. Firebombing Dresden, for example, was not morally justified just because it was our side that did it, in the same way that liking dogs isn't evil because Hitler had a German Shepherd. We can hold up our side as heroes while at the same time recognizing their flaws. We just have to resist the urge to cast historical events as simple comic book stories of good against evil. We should also make sure to let the past be the past. Of course, we should learn from it, but we must resist the temptation to cast every current event as an echo of a specific time and a specific place. Every historical figure is not the next Hitler, or Chamberlain, or Churchill. We don't need to fight every nascent conflict to stop the next World War or Holocaust. We should not censor thoughts just because someone said they could have stopped Hitler by censoring Mein Kampf 100 years ago. Let the past be a guide, but don't let it override your own senses of reason and critical thinking. Be careful about putting historical figures on pedestals. Go ahead and print the legend, but don't overreact when people start asking questions about that legend. My name is Brian Ullman, and this has been the podcast of the Gem State Chronicle. Make sure to subscribe on Apple or your favorite podcast platform, as well as YouTube, Rumble, TikTok, Twitter, or wherever this content is found. I'll see you next time.